I always like to start with people by just getting a thumbnail of how it is they come to the work that they're doing. What is it that's driving and passioning them to do what they're doing? And so if you wouldn't mind a few minutes, we could get started with that, and then we can move from that to what you're doing, and then explore how that connects to what we're talking about here.
Okay, sure. Well, in my case, there are two main drivers. The first is that I'm absolutely convinced that perhaps but at least a fundamental problem plaguing education/learning and the root cause of poor performance internationally of U.S. students, particularly in math and science, is that there is pretty much a complete absence of training in what's called in psychology of reasoning context-independent reasoning. Context-independent reasoning is, as its label suggests, reasoning about abstract structures that can be instantiated in any number of ways in any number of contexts, but the important aspects of the problem have nothing to do with the clothing of the problem. For example, a word problem in algebra, the clothing might refer to Bill and Jane and a particular car or a train or a plane, but the problem really doesn't have anything to do about those things, and that's just window dressing.
It's not the representational surface, it's the co-implicate mechanics.
I think that's one way of looking at it. I mean, the idea is that there's an underlying logical structure. Once you penetrate to that logical structure, if you have the procedures at hand to manipulate them to produce the answer, it almost becomes easy.
Mm-hmm.
So for one reason or another, formal logic and reasoning in formal logic, and I'll never be able to figure this out, is pretty much not taught in the United States. Even in mathematics, New York State has an edict from the regents that it infuse K through 12 math education, but as far as we can tell, math teachers themselves can't even solve basic logic problems, so it's hard to see how it's happening. And based on the evidence that I've assembled, by testing students who arrive out of the New York State curriculum, they're terrible actually at formal logic. So I think a big problem is that, and I just have a dream to try to address that by changing the way things are done in our educational system. So that's one of the drivers in my life. It relates strongly to what I teach and what I try to do in terms of software development for teaching. The other driver is the attempt to build machines that are as smart as possible relative to humans, at least in terms of outward behavior, and at the same time try to explain to people that there are some things that humans do that you could never get a machine to do. And I'm pretty passionate about that two-part proposition. So those are the two main drivers in my intellectual life.
Well, thank you. It's delightful to hear that you listed as your primary driver actually trying to do something to help this country's education system. I think that's fantastic. So relative to the second part, you said there's some things that computers will never be able to do as well as human beings, and you're trying to push the edge of that with your work on helping or designing machines that can actually read.
Right.
So maybe we could...
Yeah, it's somewhat paradoxical, I think, but the way I figure it, I'll only be truly enlightened as to what a machine can and can't do if I really understand what a machine can do, and the best way to get that understanding is to leverage the old dictum that if you want to understand it, you have to build it.
Right.
And so I try to build things in a way to educate myself. So if I want to learn what the underlying structure behind learning by reading is, maybe one of the best ways of going about that is to try to build a machine that does it, because you can leave no stone unturned in the search then to figure out the nitty-gritty details.
Well, that's certainly what drew my interest in my searches for people that are doing things on the edges of reading-related science, was to encounter your work, which is novel to my understanding. I mean, I don't know how many other people are trying to do this, but the problems that we're focusing on have more to do with how the infrastructure develops that allows this virtual reality experience we call reading, that we subsequently reflect on and then start to do the things that I think your system starts with, you know, relative to the processing of visual elements and how that leads to phonology and disambiguating the code and all these other layers. But relative to your work, maybe you could take a moment and take us through what are the major challenges you're trying to deal with and how you're conceptualizing this.
Yeah, first let me say it's probably safe to say that we are attacking at a stage in the process which, relative to the human case of coming to be able to read, is very late.
Yes.
So we take text, and in the initial stages of the project here, represent the text manually in a formal language. Once we figure out how to get the machine to handle the English that's already been formalized and to do nice things with it, like produce answers to questions on tests and to provide justifications for those answers, we'll go back and figure out how to render mechanical the translation of the English into the formal language. And of course, that, from the standpoint of human development, has everything backwards.
Right.
Because first, when you're very little, you're learning how to distinguish, where the words stop and end, and what individual sounds are like, and how you put them together to make words. We're pretty much taking all that for granted.
Yes.
In the early stages of the project. But the problems, the chief problems facing us are fairly easy to enumerate. The diagram problem, or the diagrammatic problem, or pictographic problem, is a major one, and apparently, as far as I can tell, it's been largely ignored even in the reading community that's connected to psychology and education. It's just astonishing to us. We really underestimated this. It's astonishing to us that as you go back to earlier books in terms of intellectual development, there are more pictures. So what role these pictures play, how they're parsed, how they're represented in the mind, and how they will be represented in the machine, and then most importantly, how in the world this information, once it somehow gets in the head of the human or the machine, is integrated with information that comes from standard text, is, as far as we can tell, a completely unexplored subject. The state of the art in machine reasoning now in 2005 is praiseworthy, but it all is based on straight symbolic information, essentially text. There's really only one or two systems on the planet that have any capacity to reason over visual information, and that's a major challenge because the books that we have on elementary math and the books we have on elementary astronomy on a space basis actually have more pictures than text. So making some assumptions about the complexity, the average complexity overall, if you just say it's equal between pictographic information and textual information, and just go with that ratio of diagrammatic information to text, actually, you would conclude that most effort should be spent working on the diagrammatic stuff. But it's exactly the opposite, at least what's happened so far. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that we have a specific commitment in the way we're approaching this problem. And that commitment is to what we believe the literature suggests is the key to top flight human reading. We're really trying to model in a machine how the very, very, very best human readers work in educational contexts. And what we believe they do, this is on the strength of taking some liberties with work by Mickey Chi and others, what we believe these super readers do is, as they read, they actually test themselves they anticipate what they may be called upon to do with the information that they are assimilating. And the very best of them do that self-consciously. So they actually may pause, they may stop reading a paragraph, and if they have to go to the bathroom, they may think on the way about what they can do with this information. And there is empirical evidence in cognitive psychology suggesting this happens in the human case. So
this is a conscious meta-reflection that's happening relative to chunks that are being digested.
Right, and to the point where the best students could probably tell you before they get a test what that test is going to look like. I mean, we're taking the empirical evidence is not an avalanche of evidence, but it's large, and this is not to say there aren't really accomplished students who don't do this, but it would suggest that if you have an essay test coming up on King Lear. My son's in 10th grade, and he had actually it was Macbeth. He really fell in love with that. And I said to him, "So you got this test coming up?" He says, "Yeah." "So you read Macbeth?" "Yes." "You love it?" "Yeah, I love it. It's a great test." "Well, what's the test going to be like?" "Well, he didn't tell us that. I don't know. I don't know what the questions are going to be like." And I said, "Did you ever think about maybe sitting down for an hour and writing down what you would say the questions should be, and then answering the questions?" And for him, he's not the best student in the world, but at least the light bulb went off at that point. He said, Dad, that's actually not a bad idea. None of the teachers ever told us to do that.
It's implicit in what you're doing.
Yes, so that whole thing's implicit in everything we're doing, and here's where the problem comes in. We have not yet figured out how to have the machine generate the anticipatory queries. We haven't figured out how the machine can generate the
which implicit in that is sorting out what is most essential out of what it's been digesting, isn't it?
Correct. What is most essential, and how to reason over what's most essential in the most productive ways once you've isolated it.
How to assemble mental models out of what's most essential, and/or add what's most essential to the existing set of mental models in such a way that there's a transfer and a capability to be generative with it.
That's right. And where generative is cashed out in our case in terms of very literally an answer to that anticipatory query along with a justification that's associated with the answer.
So it really is there's a point at which you start to approximate the problems, although not the approaches that the human mind might take to this. But there's a point at which, in terms of how you get to the representations you're learning from, that's quite different than the way the human being is going to go about this.
That's very true. Yeah, no, you're right on. Those really are the two main problems. There's an interesting connection between, I guess he's the second most richest guy that came out of the whole Microsoft
Paul Allen
making explosion. Yeah, he sponsored the. You might be familiar with the Halo project. Stage 1 is now over. The Halo, and I've got a lot of friends who participated in one of the competitors in that project. That was the attempt to build a machine able to take the chemistry AP exam. and Stage 1 is now done, and interestingly enough, in Stage 1, what they did was they cheated by allowing the chemistry, the actual test, to be formalized by hand by the competitors, and then the machine took that stuff. Machines did really quite well, actually, astonishingly well, and now they're going to Stage 2 where they have to figure out how to go backwards, just like we'll have to do. How do you get the English to the formal language automatically without humans doing it? But there are very interesting connections, and a lot of my work, I like to think I'm, at least in some small part, responsible for this, what I see as this turn in artificial intelligence back to its original roots, which were connected very strongly to psychometrics, and to not an endorsement of the use of psychometrics in the human case, but an endorsement of the just the concept of a test that has been validated and normed and so forth. I think there's just a turn to that in AI that is gathering momentum.
I haven't talked to Minsky in a while. I don't know whether he is where he is with the Society of Mind and how his reasoning projects relate to this. It's strange. In my experience with AI, that's what was so unique about finding you. Very few people have tried to model the problems that human beings have with reading.
Right. Well, the reading thing is a big embarrassment for AI because, and some of the old timers, I don't know if Minsky will say this, but for example, if you talk to, a lot of them are unfortunately now passed away, but if you talk to, for example, Ed Feigenbaum, who goes all the way back to the earliest days, I'm talking, mid-50s, he complains vociferously about the hijacking of the term learning by the field of AI. I agree with him 100%. Somewhere along the line, because people judged learning as in what humans do to be too hard to figure out how to mechanize and put in a machine, somewhere along the line, the term learning in AI came to mean reinforcement learning, statistical learning, things that require multiple trials. But this is absolutely positively not how normal human beings learn most of what they learn. They learn most of what they learn in one-shot fashion.
There's a complexity of multi-ordinal operations going on at once, though, rather than a serial linear process, right?
Well, there's a lot of machinery that's being brought to bear on this on one-shot learning. I came across a great example of this in my one of the textbooks we're using for learning by reading is I believe it's an elementary algebra book, so it's the first genuine introduction to algebra. 7th grade, 6th grade, 8th grade, depends how accelerated the student is, and we're dissecting this one chapter. And we're sitting around the table, we're looking at this, and the first sentence says, please look at the isometric dot paper, on the other page, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, what? The isometric dot paper? What the heck is that? And so, of course, we learn right on the spot, just like all the kids do, what isometric dot paper is. I went back and asked my son, look, what's isometric dot paper? He says, oh, I don't know what that is. Let me see, what portion are you talking about? Oh, that's got to be paper. And, of course, then he did the same reasoning we all did, isometric, same distance, so it's graph paper without any lines, but everywhere there's a vertex, there's a dot.
Yeah.
But I didn't know what that was.
Yeah.
So on that one-shot basis, when you're reading, you're right, there's a tremendous amount of processes that are brought to bear on that pinpoint problem. However, the fact remains, you never, or for many readers, they never saw isometric dot paper. They never even saw those words put together in that way, but then suddenly they learn it, boom, just like that. AI has never, not since this departure, tackled these kinds of problems. Even in the robotic case, robotic learning, robots learn by multiple trials and analysis of massive amounts of data to arrive at abstractions from the patterns. They're not really doing the kind of learning that we have to do constantly and that we ask our kids to do in school.
Yeah, my sense is that with humans there's so many different dimensions. There's the affective dimension with a variable on the level of interest, powering, driving, focusing what's happening cognitively. And then there's the amplitude of co-implicacy in the multiple things that are going on that can take us home to a particular point without necessarily having to go the robot route.
Right. It's very daunting.
So here again we have a situation like we did when we were first trying to get robots to walk and move, where we're discovering that things that we take for granted, like a 5-year-old's ability to read is an almost off-scale challenge to our state-of-the-art understanding of computing at this stage.
That's correct, although I wouldn't make too tight an analogy or a claim as to too tight an analogy between the walking and the reading case. At least in the case of walking, we could, right from the beginning, devise algorithms which, if implemented in a machine case, would succeed in locomotion.
Right. The complexity of walking is much less than reading, huh?
Absolutely. We don't know what the algorithms are in the case of reading, so we can't even get a machine correlate going.
Right.
If we get a machine correlate that didn't even do anything like what the human case was doing, maybe that would be a good thing. We'd be happy. We knew we could do that for locomotion, but we don't really know that we can do that for reading. So in the case of reading, it's really hard to do AI in this area without looking at the human case. It's really easy to ignore cognitive psychology, to ignore educational psychology, to ignore parts of cognitive science, etc. when you're working on an autonomous vehicle that's going to drive in the battlefield. Somebody says, well, I don't know if humans actually run that way, or I don't know if cheetahs run that way. So the guy, the person doing it says, so it works.
Yeah.
And that's not going to play in this domain. At least not now. I mean, maybe 10, 20 years from now, we'll have some insights into machine cognition that provide some shortcuts, but I don't see that now.
Is there anything that you hope to or expect to learn about the processes that you're engaged in to create machines that can learn by reading that will help us more generally understand the human challenges involved in reading?
Only if you make bridging assumptions of the sort that I already admitted we're making between, say, top-flight human readers and how to formalize that in a machine case. If you make those bridging assumptions, absolutely. In fact, we'll find out that there are some very specific mechanisms that are going on in first-rate readers if we're right about this bridge. But the bridge is one that's never susceptible of verification or falsification by experimental techniques. I mean, experimental techniques used in cognitive psychology, etc., are for the human case. You really can't. People often complain about AI. People, you guys aren't really doing experiment. How do you know this? We have to look at the data in the human case. Well, okay, we can look at the data all we want, but that data is giving you information about how the human mind works, not telling us how to mathematize. Even if we agreed what your propositions are, and you say we should transfer them to the machine case, you didn't tell us how to
represent them in a way that can be processed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but if you agree to the bridging principles, then you might say our project will provide insight into this kind of self-reflective reading that humans do, and why people who do it are so good at what they do. I think that's a pretty good bet. And then there's the obvious payoff in terms of educational technology, and that is if you can get a machine to read, then presumably any machine designed to teach students, say, mathematics, is going to be a heck of a lot better off once it reads the book it's supposed to be, that's related to the subject matter it's supposed to teach. Right now, of course, nothing like that's happening.
Right.
So-called intelligent tutoring systems are really based on just little tiny snippets of a domain.
Microscripts that don't have much flexibility or do not creatively respond to the novelty of the circumstance that the learner's in.
Exactly. And they can't do it otherwise because they have no deep understanding of the domain.
Right.
And in order to get that deep understanding, one would think they would have had to have assimilated it all, and how better to assimilate it than by reading it.
Right. In reading, in the case of human beings, though, there's no one thing that we read that's in isolation from all of our past learning. I mean, there's this buildup that's happening from the time we're born that makes us able to be proximately able to understand what it is we're reading, if what we've chosen to read or been asked to read is within a certain range of us.
Right.
And it's more than just simple word recognition. It's having an understanding of the meanings in a way that we can creatively perceive, like you showed, like you used the example of the isometric dots. Yeah.
Right. Right.
So when you talk about getting a machine to read, it's not just in order to read any particular thing. There's prerequisites. Yeah.
Yeah. The problem of the vast amounts of prior knowledge and experience that's needed is something we're just not going to be able to tackle in earnest in 3 years. I know that the hope, and of course, once you hear this hope, you'll understand that I share it, but the hope is that the groups that do have a long-standing track record in building up very, very large knowledge bases would be collaborators and players in any serious attempt to tackle machine learning by reading. And fortunately, in the case of these, I believe there are 3, depending how you look at it, 3 spearheading projects now out of DARPA on learning by reading. I think they were well selected because I don't think it's been announced yet, so I'd get myself into trouble. But I think one that's about to come on board is one that involves Psych Corporation, which has large knowledge bases. And I've already started to, I know them, but I've already started to specifically interact on this point, that maybe some of what they have would prove useful in our case. Maybe some of what we're doing would prove useful in their case.
That would require that there be some kind of a common index or ability to translate across the systems to be able to draw upon what would be the relevant background to move forward with a reading challenge, yeah?
That's true, and I believe we already have that in broad strokes. It's
How do you know in advance what would be a prerequisite? In other words, if you were going to give a machine a task to read a particular book, would you have to set as a precondition that the machine already went through so many stages, or are you looking to get to a point where the machine could interrogate a database like PsyCorp to get whatever it needs as it's moving through it?
Well, the initial move would be to bestow the machine with this knowledge base by installation to read book number 1, and bracket the question of how you could allow the machine to autonomously assemble that knowledge. But you'd like to see that happen by bootstrapping, so that there's a very small amount of initial knowledge that's provided for a quote young machine which reads simple books, and by reading these simple books acquires a larger and larger knowledge base. You mentioned the effective component. This is leaving all of that completely out of the picture, because
right.
All of this is completely formal, and there is no, if we knew how to reduce happiness to some of these equations we use, that'd be great, but we don't.
Right.
So we bracket that as well, of course. But we'd first have to just see if we can get a working system that is leveraging some of this prior knowledge to do the reading. We're not even going to, in our first phase here, we're not even going to do that. We're going to make sure the machine has on hand for the specific parts of the text it's reading the specific knowledge that we know from analyzing the text are absolutely necessary to have on hand, and then we either have to build it ourselves or get it from someone who already has it. But the format, between at least Psych and what we're doing, the underlying format for representing this data is logic. It's just there really are only 2 possibilities out there for how you're going to represent any knowledge, any data. You can either choose a numerical representation and try to do everything based on numbers, or you can try to do everything based on propositions. Everything for us is based on propositions. I don't personally, for the life of me, see how a numerical approach to any of this stuff could ever work. But that's more of a methodological commitment, and there's as you might know, there are a lot of disagreements about those issues.
Right, right. Well, it's been fascinating. Is there anything that you could say as somebody who cares about education, cares about kids, who's creative, who's deep into artificial intelligence, who's challenging themselves to develop a machine that simulates this incredibly complex human task? With all that as background, is there anything you can say about reading itself that amazes you? That's something that you're bringing you're coming from an entirely different vector than most of the people that I talk to, and yeah. So just your sense of the challenge of reading.
Yeah. Well, the first thing there are a number of things that are candidates for being featured in an answer to that question, but the thing that has hit me hardest right off the bat, and which, despite the fact that we touched upon it explicitly in our proposal and we had plans to deal with it, and that is that I think we actually all greatly underestimated the overwhelming. I think we underestimated the importance of visual information, and it's not just for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that on a percentage basis, if you look at what's on the page. I mentioned astronomy and math. I mean, my gosh, just the notion of planets appearing to go backwards when you look at their orbits from Earth's perspective. Some of that, the treatment of that in elementary astronomy books, I don't even think you could understand it without the pictures personally. But the pictures dominate completely. So in terms of percentage of the content, so there's that problem. But then there's even. I mentioned the integration problem, but there's another problem, and that is, even if you take away the explicit pictures, is it possible to read a story or a play? We know how important the visual is to math and science, that because they make it explicit. They give you the diagrams, and they have all kinds of quasi-formal languages for manipulating these things visually. But what about fields where there aren't any pictures? I mean, Shakespeare's Macbeth doesn't have a picture of Macbeth in it, or the stage, or we don't see Hamlet's country. And however, what if in order to understand it, you are internally creating in your brain the very same representations that are created when you do see a picture in a book.
Analogous to a picture in a book in the sense that the text that you're reading, in order to understand it, must give rise to a visual image that's part of your assembly of the overall understanding.
Right. In which case, it would never be possible to make any progress on mechanizing reading and truly understanding it from the AI perspective unless you solve the pictographic / diagrammatic problem. That really scares me now, because our original thought, and we even had some formal models of this, drew a sharp wedge between so-called textual information and diagrammatic information. And so now I'm beginning to wonder if we underestimated this whole problem.
Meaning, yeah, I'm totally with you, and that's a great point. So there's some kind of parsing going on to determine it's all automatic and implicit and non-obvious to us as readers, that's taking some information and operating upon it in terms of developing the generalizations and abstractions that we're understanding as we move through a text. But some of the information has to give rise to mental schematics and images and what have you that then have to loop back into that other process, and these things are happening together.
Exactly. And I didn't realize. I don't think I realized that as like I do now, and it does
daunting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's pretty amazing that we can do this.
Yeah, it's totally amazing.
Totally amazing. When you mentioned meta-reflection earlier, one of the areas that we've really been working on is the relationship between what's happening. I mean, when a child learns to read, they are developing, their brain is building artificial infrastructure in order to do it.
Yeah.
And this artificial infrastructure is having to process, information and connect up different existing dimensions of brain functionality in a way that's never been done before. It's only a few hundred years old evolutionarily, at least in case of the kinds of ambiguities associated with reading the English language. And yet there's something to be said for the level, when you look at the various indigenous people that don't read, the kinds of abstractions, generalizations that they're capable of are different than the kinds that we're capable of as readers. That reading is part of what builds the meta-reflection that is necessary for reading.
Yeah, no. Absolutely. It's, I wish I was 26, not 46.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd take 46. Oh, well, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Pleasure speaking with you as well, Dave.
Thank you very much.